This is going to be the last 30 minutes where we will have an interactive session. We heard about corporations' efforts in fighting AIDS. So first, I would like to ask Mr. Hirano to give us a summary comment about the earlier presentations. Yes, in Japan, the awareness on this issue has not been raised so much here in Japan, and that's a big problem. At JCIE, I'm sure that this is a problem that you have been struggling with. As Dr. Piot said, Japan is connected to the rest of the world. Japanese economy is connected to the rest of the world. And Toyota has offices in certain areas where they are dealing with the problem. And the problem is that this was a very lonely problem because you would be assigned a job in South Africa all of a sudden, and from the next day you will be asked to design a policy or program for AIDS. And Japan does not have a lot of experience on this, so Japanese people are not very much prepared for this effort to deal with the issue. So when you are assigned to South Africa or other countries in Africa, this is the manual for AIDS, and this is a manual for malaria. My view, what we have been asking for is to create such manuals for people going to countries in Africa. And research institutes, people have to be there, and economists should be involved to work with the people on the ground to create such manuals, develop such manuals. But what we have found out is that 4 years is not enough. More people have to spend more time to design and develop such manuals. This is not just to maintain economic efficiency. When you go to the localities, you will be able to find out that how much devastation it is to see your colleague to die, what it does to the morale of the people, not just for protecting production, to protect the community as a whole. Measures will have to be taken. And as Japan internationalizes, this is an essential method that Japan would have to adopt. And that is why we have been working on this program. I see. So quantitatively, it is important to express in numbers, but also qualitatively, finding your colleague dying in front of you. I think you need to share that with other people. Yes, in the case of South Africa, especially, you have companies from around the world operating in South Africa. And South African staff workers, they are the most dedicated because they feel that this is their own issue. And when they see their colleagues die, they have fear and they have sadness. And this has to be shared. Otherwise, corporate identity cannot be sustained in the future. Japanese society, in order to maintain the Japanese society healthy, we have dealings with the people around the world. And we have to maintain these relationships healthy. So to do that, this has to be a nationwide effort to deal with this issue. I see.
So you heard some presentations from the corporate side. So do you have any comments regarding this subject?
Yeah, I think that in addition to what we just heard, from Hirano, is that we can do something about it. First of all, the data are very clear from a kind of natural experiment when there was no treatment, how bad the situation is, but also the spectacular reversal by what is in the end not so complicated as a measure. But I think here the being prepared as management and incorporating it in the regular human resource management, I think is key. But it is, and again, what strikes me always is how spectacular the results can be once you start doing something. And that, I find, in a sense, should be an incentive for every company to do this. The problem, I think, is that for smaller companies, or small and medium enterprises. Toyota, or in South Africa, Volkswagen has also a program. Some of the Anglo-American, the mines and all that, and it's affordable. I remember one day I addressed the meeting with the board of Anglo-American in South Africa. This was when they were considering introducing antiretroviral therapy to their employees. And okay, I spoke then with the CEO in the end, and he said, you know, they had decided to do it. And I said, okay, and I would be very interested in learning about your decision making and the analysis and so on, you know, because we were asked by the whole world, particularly by development economists and development agencies and public health experts, to have a very detailed analysis of the cost effectiveness and cost benefit. And he said we started doing that, but it was too complicated. We decided to go for it because it's the right thing to do. But we will evaluate very carefully while we are doing it. And I think that is a role that we can have also here out of Japan, you know, whatever, the World Bank and so on, to document and then learn while we are doing it. Because you can't plan for everything.
You mentioned, Peter, in your presentation that early in your career, you experienced the real jungle, and then later you experienced the jungle of an international organization. I guess the part of being the jungle of an international organization is my take is that people always want to put themselves in their silo. I think you mentioned the word silo, their turf, and they also want to put you in your silo.
Yes.
But you also mentioned the need for coalition, building the coalition. So in a sense, you need to go beyond that silo, the boundary. But what is the common language that would link these people in different silos?
Yeah, I think first of all I should say that this is not only in the public sector that we see that, but also in companies. Big companies. I mean, there is human resources, there is the marketing, there is whatever the nature of the business is, and there is not that much communication in there. So, and the bigger the company, the worse the silos. I mean, that's probably unavoidable. I think the common language is people's lives. I mean, that's and what I always try to do is to say, okay, we don't have to agree on everything, but let's agree on a few fundamentals. Some basics, do we want to save these lives or not? Do we want to improve people's lives? And one can add also, do we want to go for the bottom line in what sense or not? And then see who can contribute what. And focus on what each can contribute rather than to what divides us, and the turf was. But it is very complicated. And I think this is an area in international cooperation in general where there's a lot of duplication, inefficiencies, and I think that we've made good progress through in the development field, like the Paris Declaration, Accra Declaration, and so on. It's far from being perfect, but compared to where we were 10 years ago, I mean, it's an enormous progress. But your point about common language is really important. Now I'm in academia, and it's the same thing. Our school in London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine that I'm directing now, we have a narrow focus, and that is health. But we have people who are molecular biologists, we have economists, we have clinicians, anthropologists, just name it, and they work together around a certain theme. But when someone comes from the outside, the first job is to put aside some of your jargon and all that. You need that among your colleagues for your credibility. But once you're in that group, we need to develop then this common language. And but a big challenge also is to respect other disciplines, people coming from other fields, that they can equally contribute. So it is complicated, but I'm convinced that for the big problems of today and of tomorrow, we need multiple disciplines. I was yesterday at Kyoto University, and we were dealing the group about sustainable development, survivability of societies, as it's called, post-emergency issues, dealing with disasters and all that. And here, if you think in silos and you behave in silos, I think that's the inefficiency of the response is enormous. And that's, I think, a challenge in Japan, but elsewhere also. So, but how to do that is I think we go through such extreme specialization in society, which is unavoidable because of technological developments and enormous amount of information. But at some point it has to come together. And I think their leadership in the companies is very important. It's like when the CEO of Anglo American said, we're doing this because we think it's the right thing to do, and then we'll see how to evaluate it. And you know, that is leadership. That is not, you know, that's what you need. And of course, it's informed leadership. It's not just because one morning he woke up and said that would be great to do.
Yeah. Well, I wish I could wake up that way every morning.
Yes.
Yeah. For corporations to engage in things like global health, people, you know, always one way to slice the pie is they look at cost and benefit. And we saw some analysis earlier on cost and benefit. But cost is something that's, you know, it's on, you know, it's something on your, you know, P&L sheet that you write off every year. You mentioned in your talk that we should look at this more in the long term. And so for me, it seems like for corporations to engage in global health, it's not just a matter of cost, but it's an investment, a long-term investment for the sustainability of their, you know, economic business going forward. But if you look at engaging in global health issues as an investment, how do you improve the return on that kind of investment?
Yes. Well, I thought, first of all, I fully agree with that analysis. I mean, health is not only a cost, and it's often seen as on your balance sheet as something that, okay, you've got to do, and it's a negative. But it's an investment, and we heard it in the talks about every staff member you lose. I mean, that's an enormous cost. For that individual, but for the company, retraining and all that. But I think that it's the long-term view that's going to be important. And there are things that are harder to capture, but staff morale, for example, is one. Reputation. I mean, if certain things a company does, and more and more, for both things, the staff morale and the reputation, because losing reputation or a decrease in reputation for a company, that can have enormous cost. And certainly companies that are dealing in, you know, in consumer business type. But any others, I mean, look at the banks at the moment, but it has been the case in other sectors. But I think that the longer term investments are going to be a return on the investments. In a sense, the classic ways of measuring productivity, the T, you know, the number of tea leaves, okay, and that's the easiest to measure, but not immediately for everybody. But then I think the others are the cohesion of the company, the work, the staff morale, and so on. And that's, but how to measure that? I'm sure that can be measured. I'm just not. It's not my field. Yeah.
Right. You also mentioned TCAT next year.
Yes.
When the heads of the African states come to Japan in June, what do you think that they want to hear from Japan?
I think that this is TCAT 5, and I was at 2, 3, and 4. And even from 2 to 4, I saw already quite a change. Where at 2, I think Japan was, I think, maybe the first investor development in Africa then. Today, that's no longer the case. I mean, private investor and so on. China is much bigger. And at some point, it was the Western countries and so on. So I think it is African countries, from my experience today, are very much in demand for fairer, just to use their term, trade. Trade issues will be maybe high on the agenda. How to have access to markets in both directions. I think, though, on the other hand, Japan has been a factor of consistent commitment and engagement with Africa throughout. It has not been a fashion. An illustration is tick at 5. And I think that's something that I imagine is appreciated, and we should make it easier for a dialogue. But I think it's today the agenda is really a lot on the business side, investments, and I think in the more social sector, there are different interests among different countries. You can't compare South Africa, we heard, with, for example, a country, some of the very heavily affected countries by AIDS. We did a study on what are the needs by 2031. 2031 will be 50 years after the discovery of AIDS, taking the long-term view. And in a country like Zambia, will need to spend about 3.5% of its GDP on HIV treatment and prevention. That's enormous. That will require external support. There are other countries where over 90% of all expenditure for AIDS treatment is paid for by international community, be it through multilateral channels, the Global Fund, or the very important, the US, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. So that's a very unhealthy situation, I think. That's not something in terms of sovereignty of countries, and have a dialogue around that as well. But Japan, I think, has, I would think that people will look more and more also on your own history in coming out of the terrible years after the war, and in addition to the business. But I think there will be always be an expectation on the financial side. I mean, you have to be realistic also.
Right. Okay. Well, Peter, I was thinking maybe we should take some questions from the audience, or possibly 平野さんからは何かご質問があったですか?
Or Mr. Hirano, if you have a question, no? So let us take questions from the floor. Yes.
Thank you. I'm a medical doctor from Nepal, currently doing my postgraduate at the University of Tokyo. First of all, thanks a lot for a very wonderful speech. It was really brainstorming. And my question is regarding, it's not regarding HIV in Sub-Saharan Africa or these countries. My question is regarding the HIV AIDS in those countries where we think, or where generally the government think that there is no AIDS. Especially I'm talking about the Middle East countries. When we do this research and study, we won't find any data regarding the HIV/AIDS problem in countries like Middle East, North Africa, and regarding especially I'm talking about the migrations. So how can we encourage or make them for the political commitment to do research or to do work on the field of HIV/AIDS in those kind of countries where it is like absence of information is regarded as kind of absence of infection.
Yes.
So, like, how can we make them for the commitment, especially in talking about the migration?
Yeah. First of all, we should recognize that not every country has the same level of problem. I mean, some countries, AIDS is the number one health issue. And as I mentioned, in Africa, it's the number one cause of death overall, whereas in other countries, it's much less. But with the exception of North Korea, every single country in the world has reported, that there is HIV. And what we see, when you think of the Middle East, North Africa, and other countries, the HIV prevalence, there are data, it's much lower, but it's very concentrated. There are many countries in the world, including in Asia, including in Japan, where HIV is not felt as a problem for the so-called general population because it's concentrated. And that makes it politically also far more complicated. And I think there are no magic roads to do it. In each of these countries, there are people who are aware of it. And the problem is, the challenge, again, to do what I would call is definitely basic coalition building, awareness raising. I think in some countries very important to involve religious leaders. And religions are very rarely monolithic things. You have people who are more open than others and so on. But first of all, try to see where the facts are. And we've seen major changes. I mean, when I think of China up to 2005, roughly, there was not much recognition of the issue. And now the country has quite progressive policies. Not always, I mean, it's one country, two systems also for HIV, because particularly around injecting drug use. Because there is one problem that is worse to handle from a public policy perspective than sex, let's say, that's drugs. I mean, that's a substance abuse. And that's particularly an issue in, for example, a country like Iran has a big problem, but also has needle exchange programs, even in prisons. So it is, I don't know, I think this has to be dealt with country by country. Then in terms of migration, we know for sure that there are issues, particularly in countries around the Gulf and in some others, we're relying a lot on workforce coming, particularly from Asia, and requiring a negative HIV test. You come in, and some people get infected in the country. And yet there is denial that it is there. So, it's only through dialogue, and this is where we get into diplomacy, foreign affairs, religion, just what have you, illustrating again what I was trying. I mean, I started as an infectious disease doctor and microbiologist, and I ended up is a wrong word, but dealing with extremely complex societal issues. And AIDS is often a touchstone for these things. It is a touchstone for many difficult things in society. Sorry, I don't have a magic bullet to offer you.
Yeah, actually, those countries are especially, talking about the migration, they are more focused in the deportation of the workers. They are less focused in the preventing mechanism. So that is my concern, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
他にご質問ございますか。はい、どうぞ。すみません、お名前と
すみません。
Name and affiliation, please. My name is Miyata from Sankei Shimbun newspaper. Mr. Hirano, in your discussion, you said that Toyota people felt very lonely and isolated. They had a very lonely problem. And I can understand that very, very keenly, because here in Japan, when you have not been interested in the HIV issue at all, and all of a sudden they are assigned to work in South Africa, where prevalence rate is very high, and they would feel lonely. They don't know what to do, and even if you develop measures, they are eventually returned back to Japan, and they lose interest on this issue. And this is now repeated many times over. And if that's the case, people who are expats, who are working outside of Japan, they would always have this lonely problem. Domestic HIV measures and global HIV measures, they have to be linked organically well. Otherwise, this will be a problem that you have to face only when you go outside of Japan, when you are only working as an expat. If that's the case, then you cannot have a well-developed response to AIDS, and you might end up making mistakes by taking wrong action. So it's risky. I believe that you need to have an integrated response to AIDS. Companies, corporations must be interested in HIV here in Japan as well, and they should develop their policy, and that should be taken outside of Japan when people are transferred and working locally outside of Japan. Peter, you have been saying that UNAIDS, Japan, not only providing financial contributions, Japan should consider as a field for UNAs. So, including that, Japan as a field should be utilized in dealing with HIV. That's my comment.
今ピーターさんにご質問ということ
Was there a question for Peter?
I totally agree with Hatsan because that's so nice about the term global. Global means here and there, not just far away. And it's a bit what we heard also before. One, it's a matter of credibility. You know, good practice starts at home, but also of better preparedness. So, and thirdly, you could even call it an ethical issue. So I fully agree. Good points.
皆さんなんか追加
エイズの問題に限ります。
This is not only limited to AIDS issue. Japan, what we are required to do is that in many countries, people are working in many countries. Japanese people are going outside of Japan, especially young people. They have accumulated a lot of experience. So how much of that can be fed back to our community here in Japan? That's the challenge. And one of them is this HIV issue. So what we asked this company, Toyota, is that they are a very large company. They spent a lot of cost. They took a lot of time to work on this program because, as Dr. Piot said, smaller companies cannot do the same thing. So it's the large companies that have to spearhead this effort. And if there's a lot of accumulated experience, that could be fed back to the domestic society here in Japan, and that can be shared with other people. That is what we need to do. That is what we are asked to do. Microphone, please. What has been accumulated, the experiences accumulated in Japan should be utilized outside of Japan. So it can go both ways. Yes, you're right. But having looked at the recent developments, it tends to be that overseas, including developing countries, experiences outside Japan should be incorporated here in Japan. I think that's the main interest of the Japanese people. What we can disseminate to the rest of the world from Japan, for example, the population issue. This issue has not been resolved by us Japanese, so maybe we are in the learning stage right now.
ちょっと時間が
We are starting to run out of time, so I'm afraid there is going to be a reception to follow this program. We have a reception to be held on the same floor. So if you have additional question, please grab Peter and ask your question directly. Thank you very much, the two panelists. Peter's book, No Time to Lose, translated as Jikan to Tatakau in Japanese. I think time is a resource. This is an equal resource. Time is owned by poor people and rich people. Another equality is that regardless of whether you are rich or poor, you would use this resource, time. But through this AIDS, through this infectious disease, there is going to be some inequality in time, this resource in time, because people who can live longer would die prematurely. So this very precious resource, time, could be lost as a result of this epidemic. So what can we do to prevent that from happening? This is a common mission for the entire humanity. We want to contribute. So I have thought about a lot of things reading this book. Now, from IDE of JETRO, they are the co-organizer for this event, and it was a great pleasure to invite Peter to speak at this symposium. And thank you very much for the members of the audience for coming here. We do have a reception after this program on the same floor, and there are 5 copies of the book to be distributed to you. There's going to be a lottery. So if you could slip in your business card at the reception desk, you might get a copy of his book with his autograph if you're lucky. Thank you very much once again. Let us give the panelists a big round of applause. Thank you very much indeed.